Hello. Welcome to the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Bars, open-minded conversations on some new ideas about the scientific study of consciousness and the brain. I'm Nat Geld, this show's producer. We're here today with Bernie Bars, acclaimed author in psychobiology, including his newest book called On Consciousness, Science and Subjectivity, Updated Works on Global Workspace Theory. Bernie Bars is the originator of Global Workspace Theory, GWT, and Global Workspace Dynamics, a theory of human cognitive architecture, the cortex, and consciousness, and one of the founders of the modern science of consciousness. Hello, Bernie.
Hi there. I'm Bernard Bars, and this is On Consciousness, and with me is David Edelman. So, David, you're a biologist.
Yeah, I guess.
And a neurobiologist.
Yeah.
And a fiddle player.
Yeah.
And an anthropologist.
Yeah.
And did I miss anything?
No, I think you're
you're the son of Gerald Edelman.
Well, there's that. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's probably my major accomplishment at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that took a lot of work.
Right.
So, here's my question about the history of consciousness in biology. Darwin had a public advocate who
Yes.
was called Darwin's
Bulldog.
And bulldogs at that time in the 19th century were dangerous, right? Or they were thought to be dangerous. They're actually very nice, but they were used to fight bears.
And they look quite different
And they look quite different from what?
from the modern bulldog.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right, and so Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, got us all screwed up, I think. And the way he did that was to say consciousness can't be a causal thing
Right.
because it's like the steam whistle of a locomotive. This is the industrial age, right? And locomotives everybody thinks about locomotives. And they may not know much about them, but they think about them. They're a huge symbol of power and speed and all that.
Right.
And so Thomas Henry Huxley said that, well, the steam whistle is kind of a side effect of the locomotive. And maybe consciousness is like that. It's just,
So it's sort of an
hanging
epiphenomenon.
around.
It's epiphenomenal.
Epiphenomenon was the word that philosophers picked up from Huxley.
Right.
And ever since then, we've been really confused. And this happens in the history of ideas, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Some idea gets planted, some metaphor gets planted, and everybody gets all excited about it. And people who are a little scared of studying consciousness, because let's face it, it's a scary thing for people, and for very good reasons. I don't doubt that for a moment. So this is a kind of scary topic, and at that time, certainly people would rather not know. And so the idea of it's a side effect, it really has nothing to do with the steam vessel that drives the wheels.
Right.
And that's, of course, wrong. That's the wrong kind of physics, right? Because there's conservation of energy, and the steam whistle takes off power and energy from the steam vessel.
There are sort of these causal entailments that you can't ignore. They're there. There's no doubt.
Exactly. So the steam whistle is actually not an epiphenomenon.
Right.
The steam whistle is part of the thermodynamics of steam.
Right.
As a major discovery of the time, and for trains and for moving people back and forth and so on. And so, as a biologist, let's put on your biologist hat. And how would you deal with that claim, that hypothesis, that consciousness is an epiphenomenon?
So Huxley had this view that consciousness really wasn't causal. And I don't think that I certainly don't agree with that, as at least as stated by him. I think it probably is causal, but there is a problem, and the problem is that, again, it's not directly doing something in the world. It's as in it's not, a motor neuron, and it's not directly pulling in the world. It's somewhere in the middle of all of that, and So I think to the extent that it affects what we do in the future, it does have a sort of a causal role, but it's a very strange terrain to try to negotiate, I think. And my late dad, had some issues with this. And in fact, he didn't really think it was directly causal. I mean, that's the way, at least he framed it in some of his later work. But this is an ongoing issue. It's an ongoing debate. And it does relate to the function of consciousness, of course, because if Huxley were right and it isn't causal, well, then what possible function could it serve?
Right.
And how could it possibly have been sort of under, or the components of conscious processing have been under some sort of selection pressure or something,
It couldn't have evolved.
Yeah, in essence, if it were it would have been insulated from any kind of sort of pressure to evolve, in a sense, if it didn't have any sort of causal role. But I have an interesting take. I mean, it may not be interesting to you or other people, but my take is that it's causal, but you have to think of consciousness as a sort of a more retrospective than anything else. But retrospective meaning that it is dealing with stuff that sort of just happened. In other words, the world is going on, and it's not as if consciousness is immediately simultaneous with that world. That there's this little sort of delay, right? And we can intuit that there's a delay from the biology of the system, from the physiology of the system.
In what respect?
Well, in order, for example, in the case of vision, when light hits your photoreceptors, it has to, the signal, the resulting electrical and electrochemical signals that result, they start from your optic tract, they go into your lateral geniculate, and of course they go into V1, and then ultimately certain things happen in higher visual areas to put to sort of reconstitute that frame, that visual frame. That takes time, doesn't it? I mean, not much time, right? Perhaps tens of milliseconds, but that's still an amount of time. It's not simultaneity,
Right.
right? So, I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's true, and obviously it depends upon the predictability of the input. So if we know exactly what's going to happen, we don't even have to bother being conscious of it, right? And in fact, our senses habituate. So the sensory input, if we actually stop the sensory input with respect to the wiggle on the eyes, the conscious visual object fades.
Right.
So it stops being conscious if it's completely predictable.
Yes.
That's at least a plausible
Yeah.
thought. And so consciousness, one possibility, if you look at the opposite of that, is that consciousness is needed to process novel or biologically important signals. And that's actually a very traditional idea. That's not a new idea.
Right. So do you think that we can dovetail from that into the notion that consciousness is sort of the ultimate sort of ramification of monitoring of a scene? An animal is monitoring a scene, looking for salience, looking for danger, any number of things. Well, danger as a subset of salience, something that's meaningful, and acting on that meaningful signal in some way or another, or not, as the case may be, not acting on that signal to save its own skin if it needs to be quiet. But the monitoring of a scene seems to be very important, right? It has a serious survival function, doesn't it?
For sure.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So it's not just a little point here, a little point there.
Exactly.
It's making an interpretation of the whole.
Right. And once the world becomes a complex place, let's just imagine, you flash back to the ancient Cambrian seas and just imagine sort of the earliest complex multicellular animals that have developed good eyes, that even have some form of auditory, some very limited form of auditory processing, have a good sense of chemosensation, something like smell, but underwater. Once the world gets pretty complicated and it's no longer just sort of rafts of low-lying plant life, whatever, it's sort of three-dimensional, right? And animals have started to move around in that world.
Right.
That builds a complex scene, doesn't it? And it seems that there would be a certain amount of selection pressure, a certain amount of pressure on animals to evolve a means of evaluating things happening in that complex picture, in a complex scene.
Right.
Right.
One of the problems with the word memory is that it's everything, right? It's all this stable synapses that have grown based on our life experiences. Every single second, we get more synaptic connectivity, and we get more synapses dying and being lost and being pruned. And so we get this constant adaptation, especially in cortex, but not only in cortex, of course. And that's a fabulous thing because of this enormous cross-wiring of the connectome, the connectivities of the cortex. And one little thing over here can ding another little thing over there. And
Right.
this happens in hundreds of milliseconds,
That's right.
probably. So what is it good for? Well, one of the things that it's good for is kind of associative clarification. You know, every word in natural language is ambiguous. This is kind of hard to realize, but it's very easy to demonstrate. And you can look at a dictionary.
Right.
Just look at the multiple meanings of
Right.
very simple words, very short, common words that
Sure.
2-year-olds understand pretty well. But 2-year-olds, when they hear the word bit, they might not think about the computer science
Right.
meaning of bit. But at some point, kids these days probably started thinking that way.
Sure.
And ambiguity is not just for human beings. I think rabbits and snakes and
Absolutely.
all kinds of organisms have to resolve this very confusing world
Sure.
that we live in.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the plausible functions
Right.
of, reduction of uncertainty is a useful phrase.
Yes. And with further experience, of course, things in the world become less ambiguous, as you've more or less said. And this is sort of a variation on the theme that we discussed earlier, I think, with Jay Geld, which is the notion of error correction in a certain sense. It's sort of error correction played out over sort of longer stretches of time, but you hone your dynamic representations of the world in a certain sense. And of course, that's very important for survival. That is a sort of a somatic adaptation in our brains to the world.
Somatic in the sense that they're
Within
real
the
cells. that
and it's
do
within the
real
lifetime.
things.
It's within moments of the animal's lifetime, as opposed to, it's not programmed in. It's set by experience over long stretches, over an entire lifetime. Right. So let's just assume, I think we can be reasonably confident that consciousness has some sort of functional role in the world, right? Or for us, for animals generally.
Right.
And so that actually allows for the possibility that we could somehow enhance it or fine-tune it in some way. And so how would we go about doing that? And what would that look like?
Where do you want to start?
Well, there have been some interesting studies recently that have pointed to that very possibility. David Edelman, for one, has studied synesthesia, and he mounted that very, very large online study of synesthesia. And he went on from that and actually started to explore the possibility of introducing sort of otherwise artificial cross-modal processing of the world by putting together clothing that had sensors that would they would give you feedback, haptic feedback, like tapping in certain places, if you were, say, moving in a certain way or moving backwards, and it was almost like creating a new sense, sort of something like vision based on almost based on sort of a sonar, but something like vision, sort of a visual space, but not within vision, and a totally different feedback, something coming through touch, for example.
Exactly.
So the question is, would we derive any benefit from that? Because it's clear that we can do these kinds of things. The brain is sufficiently plastic that even in a person who is otherwise normal, certainly doesn't naturally express the elements of synesthesia, and maybe you should unpack synesthesia. So what are we talking about when we're talking about synesthesia?
Well, I want to make sure this is right. So synesthesia, as I understand it, is in a sense a kind of halo of different sense modalities when I read black letters on a white background.
Right.
So it becomes enriched perceptually. Is
Right.
that correct?
I think that's that. Yes, definitely. You're moving right along the right track. An example would be grapheme synesthesia, where it's almost, people have described it as a case in which somehow the wires are crossed, and I think that's sort of a weird way to put it. But the idea that when you see a P, you see color. It's purple. When you read a P, when you read a P in a word, it appears as purple. So you get these sensoria that other people wouldn't get. And it's almost as if sort of something is crossing in a unique way.
Right.
And the question is, would that be an enhancement just to sort of create an artificial sense? Or, there's a device that somebody invented, I think about 20 years ago, which was akin to artificial sonar. It was sort of like imposing a bat's sense of the world on us. And it was a fairly simple device. It involved more or less a headset and sensors that would, like radar, that would be picking up, sort of bouncing sound off the walls, and then giving you a sonic feedback through earpieces or headphones of a particular tone. If it was rising, like boo, you were getting closer to something in the world. If it was falling, boo, you were receding from that.
I see.
And people could wear these things, and purportedly within the space of, say, 15 or 20 minutes, they could literally walk around blind in a room and negotiate obstacles with no problem whatsoever, but they were effectively blind. They weren't seeing anything. They were just going by the input from the device. Now, what can we do with that? Because clearly it's playing with our perceptions, right? Or it's not playing with our perceptions, but it's modifying them in some way that's otherwise not normal for us.
It's a fabulous phenomenon. And I think sensory substitution is one of the labels that was used for part of it, but it probably has more than one name. And the way I would tend to think about it is that consciousness has a kind of pointing function. And so baby and mother, right? And baby is crying. That has a pointing function for the mother because it's distressing, right? And there's an empathic relationship there. And if it hurts for the baby, it also hurts in the insula of the mother. At least that's a hypothesis. And then you get the mommy airplane thing, right? With twisting around and making eye contact with mommy and pointing upward at the same time and saying, "Mommy, airplane." And this is a fabulously complicated thing, right? Because there's all kinds of systems that are being engaged in this single coherent action. This kid is only 2 years old or whatever. So that's dramatic, and it's a pointing action.
Right. So this would be sort of a further elaboration in a way. And I guess the real question, or the corollary question, is, can we imagine a world or a particular situation in the world in which modifying our senses or creating sort of artificial sort of cross-modal, sort of sensory attributes redounds to us some sort of an advantage?
Oh, absolutely. If it takes 15 minutes to acquire that cross-sensory skill, there's a reasonable chance that we're kind of prepared to do this cross-modal integration.
Right.
And one of the fabulous things that I've picked up fairly recently is that all known languages, and of course those are either recent languages or the languages that got written down, maybe at most 6,000 years ago by the Sumerians. But written languages and oral languages, they all have this pointing thing, like there, that, me, you, us. All these are essentially pointing things, and then we even have a standard language universal where you refer to something you just mentioned before within the same discourse.
Right.
So one of the great insights, I think, from linguistics is that there are no known languages that are simple.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the farther you go back, the more complicated they become.
Right.
So we have to have some increased respect for the smarts of people who evolved these languages, as long ago as 6,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this pointing function, but now it's become abstract.
Right.
And we develop vocabularies, right? And we say E equals MC squared. And holy moly, what suddenly happens is that the whole cosmos, in some sense, is summarized in this weird formula. So, and that has a pointing function, right? Because now other people start wondering, what does this mean?
So in essence, in considering how we might elaborate on consciousness, how we might improve on consciousness, we're sort of going back to the classics, right? We're sort of going back to the notion of this pointing function, this fundamental function of consciousness. And that's really interesting. One other perhaps real-world example, perhaps a little bit of a dark real-world example, is something that our mutual friend Mark Minton has discussed with me at length many times, which is relevant particularly for people who are in the warfighting industry.
Oh.
We won't unpack that too much in terms of morality or ethics here, but a kind of a method, a new methodology, or a new instrumentation for tuning fighter pilots to their immediate environment at 20,000 feet. If somebody is firing an air-to-air missile at them, you can't really rely on vision. Is not going to be fast enough, interestingly enough. Even vision in a heads-up display is not going to be fast enough. So what do? You put essentially sound sensors on the body of your plane and the skin of your plane. The plane can pick up the sound of the missile coming from the back. The pilot wears a headset or a set of headphones that engage him with a 3D sonic world.
Right.
And he basically, it's almost as if the plane becomes an extension of his awareness of the world, of his perception of the world in the auditory channel.
Right.
And interestingly enough, pilots respond much quicker. And then again, it's three-dimensional. So when the missile's coming from behind, well, it's more subtle than that. It's coming, say, at a 30-degree angle. And the pilot gets that in his headset, and he hears the direction of the missile, and he can make an evasive response much more quickly than if he relies on some sort of rear heads-up display that shows him from behind where the missile is. This is far better because it gives him a lot of highly resolved information, spatial information.
That's interesting.
And that, in a sense, is kind of, well, let's just say it's an enhancement of his perception, but in another sense, it's kind of an extension of his capacity, his conscious capacity, right? It sort of changes, it's an interesting and new variety of a potential content of consciousness. Right.
The junction of hearing and vision. Is that?
Yeah, well, it's really
hearing and imagination. What do you think?
It's really, just imagine yourself listening to a wonderful surround system. Say you're in a movie theater, and you're watching the latest Star Wars movie, and the sound envelops you, right?
Right.
And you get the sense, there are, people fighting with lightsabers behind you,
right?
And you hear it, and you don't just hear it behind you. It's not so generalized. It's very specific.
Right.
You can hear, they're off 30 degrees to the right, that kind of thing. Now, I don't sit in a movie theater thinking about this stuff like this, but
no,
I should do that more often.
Yeah.
But that's akin to the fighter pilot example, because that's what they're hearing in these headsets. And that, again, that is a tremendous improvement on their capacity to detect threats and react quickly.
And that goes to the ancient idea that consciousness is for integration, right?
Yes. So fundamentally, consciousness is an integrative function. And I think that's kind of a good way to, to sort of wrap this particular aspect. It's very, very interesting stuff.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Bernie.
And
It's
I
a
really
privilege.
appreciate it.
It's a privilege.
And this is Bernard Bars on Consciousness with David Edelman, who knows a lot about consciousness.
Cheers. Thank you, Bernie.
To show our appreciation, we are offering our listeners a 50% discount for any edition of Bernie's book on consciousness, science, and subjectivity, updated works on global workspace theory. Just go to shop.thenautiluspress.com, spelled shop.thenautiluspress.com, and be sure to enter the word books, BOOKS, in the coupon code box during checkout for that extra 50% savings. Of course, Bernie's books are available everywhere books are sold, although your 50% discount is only available in the Nautilus shop. If you'd like to discover more about the conscious brain and learn more about global workspace functions, please visit Bernie's new website at bernardbars.com. And I'm going to spell that also, BERNARDBAARS.com. And thank you for listening.